Let me acknowledge the Ngunnawal people. I bring greetings from Cape York Peninsula. Let me thank the Board of Mental Health Australia for this kind invitation for me to address you here tonight. I acknowledge the important work people in this sector do for our Australian people. I was told yesterday that something that I already knew, I suppose, that our people are amongst the saddest of Australians. That kind of cut me to the quick. I knew that, but I hope for so much better for my people, and I've dedicated my life to trying to turn things around for us in the region I come from. I want to talk about a few things. The first thing is a story of political violence and the role that political violence has played in the destruction of the mental health of our people. There's a community in Cape York that was a vital and healthy community under the control of the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterians had been, in their own way, paternalistic, but at the same time had allowed the culture and languages of the people and the cultural practices of the people to survive. And they had been largely free from the violence of the frontiers. They were largely intact by the 1970s. And then the Queensland government issued a bauxite mining lease over their reserve lands without their consent or consultation. And they were not happy about that. The lease was given to a multinational corporation in 1975 under special laws passed by the Queensland Parliament. The church helped the people take a court case for breach of trust by the relevant Queensland authorities. They succeeded in the Queensland Supreme Court in overturning the law, but the Queensland government appealed to the Privy Council in London, and the Privy Council overturned the Supreme Court's decision. So the lease was preserved. The multinational held on to it for the next 25 years. They did nothing to develop it. But because of the action of taking the court case, the malicious Bajilki-Peterson government decided to kick the Presbyterians out of the mission, which they did in 1978. After 100 years of the mission, it was now a government-controlled township, I suppose. And the government introduced a local government system and replaced the reserve with a new tenure. And the minister, for those of us old enough to remember him, Russell Hinds, he wanted a revenue solution for the community. The new council had to have money to run itself, and the best solution he saw was for the council to open a canteen. And there were surveys, and everybody said, no, we don't want a canteen. The levels of alcohol consumption amongst the people of that community were very low. It was only the men, and young men in particular, who drank. And they had to go to Weipa to access alcohol. Anyway, the thing dragged on for years. And eventually the Queensland government got its way, and a canteen was established in 1985. All of the suicides post-date 1985. And there are dozens and dozens. All of the homicides post-date 1985, and there have been dozens and dozens. All of the incarceration post-date 1985. And hundreds and hundreds of people from that community have been in prison in the decades since. Fetal alcohol syndrome became a raging problem, and by the time I first came to know the community in 1990, it was, after 5 years of the canteen, the place was a war zone of violence and social breakdown. We didn't put a halt or put some kind of restraint on the grog supply for another 20 years. We had to advocate management plans for alcohol that reduced the amount of alcohol flowing into the ex-mission. I took too long to confront the grog thing. I was working on native title and land rights, but I should have been working on the grog, because the scores and scores of children with fetal alcohol syndrome, who are now the parents of the children today, and the problem we're grappling with in the community, where violence and disorder and sadness is the week-to-week norm, is because we're dealing with the children of the children, whose brains and bodies have been severely impaired by trauma, alcohol, epidemics of drugs. When they started the canteen, there was no cannabis in the Cape York communities in 1985. Now it's completely endemic. And methamphetamines are now the new problem. Bikies regularly have access to people in the community, and they've got their networks well established in remote communities. 10 years ago, I worked with the leaders of the community to revivify the school, which had something like 20% attendance on any day. And I put more love and work into that school than I have into anything. And we created an oasis for the children of that community. But the Queensland government shut the school down arbitrarily in 2016, a Labor government, would you believe? Simply because they disagreed with the system of literacy instruction. Anyway, a great political violence was committed against this community, against the most vulnerable children. And the culprits were not just conservative. The culprits of this violence have been as much Labor as anyone else, as the National Party. This is a story I've tried to tell. I've written about it in my most recent collection of essays, but I get absolutely no response from anyone. Nobody wants to deal with political violence at the hands of the state that is less than 30 years old. A healthy, confident, proud, intelligent people. I worked with that old generation of bush-born people, the grandparents and great-grandparents of the children today. I never came across are much more intelligent people than the ones from that community. And today, their great-grandchildren are suffering from all kinds of mental health problems and debilities caused by the Queensland government. The government took back the school. I think we had the attendance at about 50% by the time when they took the kids back. Our best years were around 70%. Every child carefully supported to attend school regularly. And then the Queensland government's been running the school for the last 7 years at an average of something like 25%. It is really hard to see light at the end of that tunnel. But if the Queensland government allowed me to go back into that school tomorrow, I'd be there. I'd be there to start again. So, a lot of our problems are the consequence of political violence experienced in this country by communities like that. Originally at the hands of Bajilki Peterson, because he didn't like the fact that the people challenged him in court, but also by the Labor government. Glencore, probably the most corrupt and sleazy mining company you're likely to find operating in Australia, paying no taxes, were awarded that lease we're talking about by the Queensland government, by the Labor government, with no benefits guaranteed to the local landowners. There's a parlous situation of injustice, and it's almost impossible to awaken the Australian community that the issue of trauma and history and violence is not an ancient story. This is a story that's played out over the last 30 years. Okay. Secondly, we need recognition, and this is the latest campaign for the Voice to the Parliament is 15 years old, starting in 2007. John Howard committed at the eve of the federal election then that he would move within 18 months to put a referendum to the Australian people to recognise Indigenous Australians. That precipitated a corresponding response from the Rudd opposition, and then on election eve, Rudd said, no, I'll do this in the second term. I made the same promise as Howard, but I'm now changing it at the very last minute to say that I won't deal with it until the second term. So nothing was done until Gillard became Prime Minister. And she set up the expert panel in 2011, and there has been 10 plus years of consistent public policy development process. Has any question, has any issue been the subject of as much parliamentary inquiries, public reporting, consultations, as constitutional recognition? There simply has not been. We're now about to enter our 12th year of discussion about constitutional recognition, and the Albanese government will put this to a referendum sometime next year. The proposition is simple, that there be an advisory body called The Voice, representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that is enshrined in the Constitution to provide advice to the Parliament in relation to laws affecting Indigenous peoples. One of the arguments against the voice is that it is establishing a separate racial institution in the Constitution. But of course, our presence in the Constitution at the moment is based on race. In 1967, the Australian people approved a referendum that finally saw the federal parliament have authority to legislate in relation to Aboriginal affairs, and this was done via the race power. So race is the basis upon which we were included in the Australian Constitution in 1967. And yet our opponents say that somehow the recognition of a voice is going to create this precedence of race in the Constitution. Of course, the other argument is equality, that to recognise a voice breaches the idea of equality. All Australians should be the same and should have the same entitlements and rights and so on. But our Constitution is actually equal in the House of Representatives and highly unequal in the Senate. When the Federation was first formed in 1901, there were more Aboriginal people than there were white people in Tasmania, in the colony of Tasmania. And yet the colonists in Tasmania got 6 senators in the new arrangement. Even today, the number of non-Indigenous people in Tasmania is about 500,000. The number of Indigenous people in this country is 700,000. And yet white Tasmanians get 12 senators. The furphy of inequality. We live in a federal system that empowered the small colonies to hold their own against the larger states. And by the way, probably one of the most stark implications of the Tasmanians having 12 senators is the fact that Australia subsidises transport into Tasmania from the mainland so that food and other goods can be provided to that state at affordable prices. No similar provision is made for transport to remote communities on the mainland. You would think that some of these very remote communities where transport is such a huge cost, where food is so expensive and so limited in supply, if we had a voice, we would be arguing with the federal parliament that perhaps we should be extended the same provisioning as the people of Tasmania are. We've got our work cut out for the voice. The majority of Australian people are with us, but the challenge we have is to secure a majority of voters in a majority of states. So I said in my Boyle lecture that our number one problem is that we are the most unloved people in the country. We're such a small minority. Most white Australians don't know a blackfella. Never met him, never went to school with him. Might have played football with them or seen them around in a football club. And yet Australians have such vehement opinions about us. Never met us. But they talk about us with such certainty. as if they know us. And the sheer unkindness is sometimes extremely dispiriting. We have to overcome it somehow in this campaign. We have to find love. We have to somehow find some empathy. Same-sex marriage had it easier. At least they were the subject of empathy from family and friends and colleagues and workmates. There is not the similar here. We're going to rely on Australians digging deep and finding something more than is usual when it comes to political empathy. But the signs are good. The signs are good. All of the polls have been consistent for a long time now that the majority of Australians support recognition in the Constitution. And we are going to have to call upon Australians in the coming period to take responsibility for the future. You know, it really doesn't fall to 3% as to whether this will succeed or not. It falls to the 97%. And yet, the 97% are sitting back as if somehow the 3% have to carry this thing. You have to take responsibility for Australia. This question is not an Indigenous question. This is an Australian question. And when is it that the country is going to take account of its responsibilities? And to do the thing that wasn't done in 1901, that wasn't done in 1770, that wasn't done in 1788, we have an opportunity to do a very modest thing. The voice is very straightforward. The provision that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese proposed says that, well, there shall be a voice in recognition of the First Peoples of Australia, and that voice, will be the functions and representation of the voice will be determined by Parliament. And in particular, it will have the function of advising the Parliament on laws that are made in respect of Indigenous people. There's at least one good argument why we should have a special say in relation to laws affecting us, not the least because the provision in the Constitution that allows the Parliament to legislate in relation to Aboriginal people only applies to us. So shouldn't we have a say in relation to Parliament's exercise of that power? Because it's a power that's not exercisable in relation to anybody else. Australia is a very intransigent country. In relation to Indigenous rights, there's possibly not a more intransigent country than ours. It was last to arrive at native title. Native title was found in the United States in 1823, New Zealand 1859, Africa, Malaysia. The English common law had declared the existence of native title in colonies around the world long before Mabo in 1992. The Australian High Court had in fact found native title in PNG long before it found native title in Australia. Recognition is fundamental. It's fundamental to self-esteem. It's fundamental to the freedom for Indigenous people to be themselves, to preserve our culture, to determine how it is that we can be a modern version of ourselves and not be told who we should be. And the Constitution needs to give us that freedom. The freedom to determine how it is that we keep our traditions, our rituals, our culture, our relationship with the land, our religion, and how we engage with modern Australia. For too long we've been told that it'd be best we disappear. That in order to be educated and healthy and be a part of the country, and that we should allow our cultures to disappear and our languages to disappear. That has been the proposition we have bridled against and resisted for so long. The day we have constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians is the day the demand of assimilation dies. No longer will we talk about assimilation and demand that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders be assimilated. No. We decide who we are and how we engage with modernity and what we keep of our past. Recognition is that important. It's the starting place for esteem, and it's the starting place for pride, and it's the starting place for freedom. All good things cascade from there. Sure, in Cape York, as everywhere else, we have been running all kinds of strategies and programs and endeavours in our community to pick ourselves up off the ground and place our children on a better trajectory. Try to repair the damage that's been done. We do that in terms of repair of languages. We do that in relation to repair of our land. We do that in relation to repair of families, showing that families can be rebuilt. That children can have hope for the future. And if we invest in them, they can have a better life than their parents. On a whole lot of fronts, we have made progress on the ground, but we are impeded. We are impeded because we're not recognised and we don't have a voice up on the hill here. To the hill. We need voices of the community. I'm not interested in the voices of politicians and political parties. People point to our Indigenous MPs, but they're voices of the political parties. They're good people, like a lot of other good politicians. But that is not what we are talking about. We want voices of the community to be heard, so that the school I talked about to you in Cape York can have a voice. And maybe we can start again, given the chance to start again. To pick up the broken pieces caused by the political violence of the Queensland government. The burden of mental health in that community is just staggeringly overwhelming. In a community of 1,200 people, 400 of them are on some kind of medication. And there's a plethora of services, but no mental health services. I think by the time you count the for-profit and not for-profit and governmental service delivery that goes into that community, I think the last count we did was about 400 people visit that community any one year, and there's only 1,200 people there. And, a proportion of that service delivery makes sense and does good, but the rest of it is just parasitic on the misery of the people. So, we've got to move on this voice, and you have to take responsibility. I'm sorry. I've got to tell you, white fellas, straight to your faces. You've got to take responsibility for your country. This referendum is about what choice you make. You can't expect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia to carry this referendum to the future. We've got to take responsibility for it. And I believe that if we do, we will succeed. Let me once again pay tribute to all of you who work in this most important field. Who is not affected by mental illness? Which family is not touched by mental illness? And the fact that you and your organisations have dedicated yourself to working in this sector and supporting sad Australians who need help is just an absolute tribute to you all. I want to thank the board again for this kind invitation to speak with you. And I've just arrived in a certain mood. So I haven't been able to dig deep for I can't suppress my anger. I'm angry. I'm angry for those children in the communities who this very night don't have a solution. And we got to, there's a lot of work to be done. And I know it's easy to turn a blind eye. Well, it's in the bush, whatever's going on up there. But I think this is something that I'm telling you, people say, why the voice? It's not important. It has no relationship to practical change on the ground. Yeah, you hear that? What's the kind of practical benefit of having a voice? And I just shake my head at that. I know what it is to try and achieve change on the ground. To have food on the plate, to have a fridge in the house, to have a school that the children can go to where they're able to learn, to become literate, and to end up in, 12 years, the quickest return is 12 years. You want to change your life? Give me 12 years. We do it regularly. But, so the people who say, yeah, the voices, they would not know what they're talking about. They wouldn't have a clue. They don't understand the structural situation that our people are caught in. And that even as we seek to support people, to budget their money, to make sure there's food in the house, make sure there's tuck shop money for the school, make sure the kids have got clothes. Even as we're doing that, we have to change the structures so that the structures enable development and growth instead of impeding everything we do. So the voice is part of our plans. It's an absolute crucial part of our recovery plan for the future. That's what I want to leave you with. I want to leave you with the understanding that the voices are crucial to our plans to get our people out of the hole we're in. Thank you.